Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to have had that introduction. I'm not exactly sure what I'm an expert in that gives me the right to do this, but perhaps we'll find out. Now, are these things still working? This one is it? Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I was very pleased to be asked to come and address this conference, and pleased then to be given the opportunity also to do this rounding off. I must say, when it was suggested to me that I should try to summarize the day and bring together its themes and so on, I thought, whoa, wow, okay. But I love a challenge, so I said yes, straight away almost. And well, I think it's been an excellent day. What I'm going to try to do is to draw together some of the threads from each of the 4 talks that followed mine and some of the questions that we had as well. And to see if I can bring those together, as I say, a little bit, and provide us with maybe a bit of a platform for carrying on smaller discussions with afterwards and onward into the future, hopefully. Something I thought was a good feature of today is I think we've come to have a little bit of a sense of Wittgenstein as relevant to physics. Wittgenstein is a thinker in something like what I called earlier philosophical physics. And I think it's become clear during the day that there's plenty of room for further scholarly and conceptual work on Wittgenstein and physicists and Wittgenstein and physics. And I'm sure that some of the people in this room will do some of that, and that'll be great. This sense was certainly amplified by Susan's talk, which followed mine, which I'll just make a few brief remarks about. I was very interested in Susan's thoughts about what Wittgenstein taught in 1938 about action at a distance and about indeterminism as involving a revolutionizing of science. This is an interesting example, which I hadn't really thought about before, of how one might see Wittgenstein as anticipating Kuhn. I was also interested in the way in which she brought out for us, I think, the way in which that motto of Wittgenstein's that I drew your attention to, "I'll teach you differences," could and should be applied to thinking about maths, to think about maths as a motley, maths as exhibiting a lack of unity, which is not a lack, right? So you might say, oh, there's a lack of unity in maths, but what Wittgenstein thought is, well, that doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with it. How she enabled us to see, I think, how Wittgenstein was very interested in taking incommensurability seriously, how we might see different number systems as being contained within what we call the numbers. And that connects to her interesting remarks about the infinite as unending possibility, which I think is an extremely important conception to get clear about. Unendliche Möglichkeit. And she alluded in that context to the distinction between the actual and the potential infinite, a distinction which, of course, comes originally from Aristotle. And she said, I think quite rightly, that Wittgenstein was very open to the idea of the potential infinite, but not to the idea of the actual infinite. And I think this is a very important aspect of Wittgenstein's thinking about this very important and difficult matter of infinity. Ideas of actual infinity or completed infinity, Wittgenstein thought were either incoherent or not successfully ideas of infinity at all, because the whole point about infinity is its uncompleted nature, that there can always be one more, that there can always be one number more. And I thought she made an interesting connection of this with Wittgenstein on the nature of rule following as, in a certain sense, necessarily an open-ended activity. Finally, I was interested in her thoughts again from this idea of unendliche Möglichkeit, of space giving to reality an unending opportunity of division. Although I thought it was perhaps worth stressing that that unending opportunity of division should be understood as a conceptual matter and not necessarily as it were, a physical prediction or claim. Turning to the talk of Professor Carlo Penco, we had early on in his talk remarks which were interesting about the possible association between a moment of, if you like, verificationism or instrumentalism in Einstein and a similar moment in Wittgenstein. I'd like to remark on that I think it's very important to be clear that this is very much a moment in Wittgenstein's thought, a moment that he has second thoughts about later. He develops the idea of verificationism, but he then comes to contextualize it and reduces its centrality. I'm no Einstein scholar, but I understand that there's something like the same phenomenon in Einstein, which is interesting, of him becoming less keen on an alleged centrality to something like verificationism or more broadly instrumentalism as time goes by. Carlo argued that our logic, according to Wittgenstein, must be coordinated and rigid. I'm concerned that might potentially mislead us. One might put it this way. For Wittgenstein, as I understand it, logic is only as rigid as it actually is, and the rigidity which it has is to be found in its actual use and in its actual application. So a famous example from Wittgenstein is he says, if I say, stand roughly there, is there anything problematically vague about what I've said? And he suggests, well, no, there isn't. Stand roughly there might be exactly the right instruction that I want to give to somebody. If I'm trying to draw a picture, is it always a good thing if the picture is, as we put it, more and more exact a copy of what it's meant to be a copy of? Well, not necessarily. Think, for example, of photo fit pictures. Think of pictures drawn based on victims' descriptions of criminals. If that picture is drawn too precisely, it will actually serve its purpose less well than if it's drawn to just the right degree of rigidity which is present in the description of the victim. And I'll come back to this point. Carlo spoke to us about the absurdity of a perspective wholly from outside. And for me, this was very resonant with the opposition, as we might put it, in both Wittgenstein and Einstein, to a certain kind of absolute conception of the matters which they were discussing. And I think it's useful to think in this connection of the way in which we can think about logic, or we can think about the world, if you like, of sense or of meaning, as something that for Wittgenstein should be conceived of as a universe roughly as we nowadays conceive of as the actual universe. In other words, it's not merely finite. It's not something you can measure the edge of or get to the edge of, but neither is it something which there is anything outside of. There is not even a vacuum outside the universe. Similarly, with regard to sense, there's nothing outside it. Nonsense is not another kind of sense or a kind of special kind of sense. It's just nothing. It's just a nothing that masquerades as something. Turning to Carlo's discussion of relativism, I had a few concerns about this. I was concerned about the identification of Winch as a relativist, which I'm not sure is accurate. It seems to me that Peter Winch, in his great article, Understanding of Primitive Society, seeks to clear away prejudices against our comprehending the possibility of there being different games from our scientific games being played among different peoples. I think this is actually somewhat similar to the interpretation which Carlo himself offered, but let me go into this a little bit more. Carlo's remarks about an opposition which we find in Wittgenstein famously expressed towards the end of part 2 of the investigations, towards certain concepts being regarded as absolutely the correct concepts, is a remark which I've discussed in my book on Kuhn, and suggested that this remark of Wittgenstein's could be seen as anticipating Kuhn's ideas of paradigm shift. If one thinks that the concepts which one is working with in a given scientific discipline at a given time are absolutely the correct ones, to get one out of that mindset, one can with profit look at phenomena such as the chemical revolution, in which there was an almost total change of the concepts that were being used. But I don't think that the best available interpretation of Wittgenstein's wood cellars is quite the one that Carlo gave us. It's not clear that the wood sellers are like the Zandi who Winch discussed in Understanding a Primitive Society. It's not clear that there is any they. It's not clear that we're really meant to be able to succeed in imagining the wood sellers as a real tribe. And this relates, of course, to the discussion that Ray then had with Carlo in the question session. And David Sabone's article in the book I edited, The New Wittgenstein, helps to bring this out, I think, by suggesting, along with one or two other articles in that book, that what Wittgenstein was seeking to do with the wood sellers parable was actually to criticize Frege. To criticize Frege, for example, when Frege said there could be an hitherto unknown form of madness, which was people thinking in a non-logical or illogical way. And Wittgenstein actually said about this that it's not clear that you could succeed in describing to us what this hitherto unknown form of madness of thinking illogically would be like. And arguably what he was trying to do with the wood sellers was to give us the illusion of being able to describe that without necessarily being able to actually succeed. Wittgenstein's thought experiments, unlike most of Einstein's, I would suggest, deliberately self-deconstruct. They are, as we might put it, objects of comparison which shed light through their nonsensicality, as well as through any sense that we can find in them through effecting a shift in our preconceptions of the type that Winch sought to make feasible for us. And so when Carlo said, well, you're free to use language in any approximate way if you wish to. This was in the discussion section in relation to the final question in the discussion session. Again, I think there's something wrong about that. Calling something approximate is too easy to hear that as a term of criticism. Vagueness is thoroughly purpose relative. Another example that Wittgenstein gave about this in the Philosophical Investigations is, he said, somebody might say, and this is again criticizing Frege, somebody might say that an enclosure with a hole in it is as good as no enclosure at all. And Wittgenstein asked, but is this actually true? And of course we can soon think of examples in which it's not. If, for example, if you've got a load of sheep enclosed within a fence and you want to keep them in, but there are holes in the fence, it's not a problem as long as the holes are smaller than the sheep. And in fact, most fences, by definition, do have holes in them. So in response to the final question, which said, look, Wittgenstein wants to defend our ordinary practice, and it can look as though someone like Einstein wants to attack it. Is there a deep tension between Einstein and Wittgenstein here? I would suggest that it's a manifestation of scientism to think that our ordinary practice is incoherent, and that, as was brought out, it may be that there's a certain sense in which we may wish to raise the possibility that scientists' or physicists' own practices are in a certain sense incoherent. Perhaps we're waiting for a new Hertz or Wittgenstein in order to resolve the contradictions that lead people to search for a grand unified theory. But insofar as any practice, ordinary or scientific, is successful and achieves its purposes, then it's a rash person who claims that it actually is incoherent. And I would suggest that the so-called vagueness or approximate nature of our ordinary language is simply not a problem so long as we remain in the sphere where that ordinary language is actually being used. Turning to John Tejedor's talk, which I very much appreciated, 3 points I'll make about this. Firstly, I think that John brought out something very nice when she said, in her criticism of the natural necessity view, we would need to know what facts obtain before we could decide what operation applies, and this causes a problem for that view. I would connect this with quotation 5 from my handout, of course, the quotation from the Tractatus, where we have Wittgenstein saying, look, the deep problem with the modern worldview is the thought that the laws of nature allow us to explain everything. And suggests that the way we might think about what John was saying there is that laws of nature aren't facts. I don't mean to say by that they are things either. They're roughly speaking more like ways of seeing or ways of organizing
facts, which is something very different. And that's what Wittgenstein is talking about when he turns in the sections which Trond didn't tell us so much about towards a kind of positive take on what we ought to say about causation and the natural sciences. Secondly, Trond gave us, especially in the question and answer session, I thought, a very interesting discourse about what it is for something to be in the Tractatus, or for that matter to be in Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. You can find lots and lots of sentences in those works which clearly do not express something which you, the reader, are actually supposed, as it were, at the end of the day, to think, or that Wittgenstein consideredly thought. There are many sentences which function in what we might call, and what Matthew Ostrow has called, a more dialectical fashion, or in what Cora Diamond has called a transitional fashion. So one has to be, if you like, on one's guard and read Wittgenstein more indirectly than might appear to be the case. You can't just find a sentence and say, well, look, Wittgenstein says it right there, so that's what he thinks. Having said that, I did think there was something a little bit odd in Trond's claim that Wittgenstein is not saying that there can only be logical necessity. But he does say very clearly in the Tractatus, as one of the questioners brought out, that there is only logical necessity. I think that Trond may have missed a little bit of a trick by not going new Wittgensteinian on this remark, because of course this remark is absolutely central to the new Wittgenstein interpretation of Wittgenstein, which was begun by Cora Diamond in throwing away the ladder. And the thought would be then something like that the remark, there is only logical necessity, is for Wittgenstein a classic example of a remark which is intended to be taken as a sats, as a claim, but that you may actually have trouble succeeding in taking as a sats. Eventually it will start to flicker for you, just as the wood cellars flicker. It's something like what Wittgenstein later calls an object of comparison. Crucially, the way that Cora Diamond develops this point in her epochal article, Throwing Away the Ladder, is by suggesting that it's pretty clear that the remark, there is only logical necessity, is self-destructive, and that Wittgenstein must have been only too aware of this. The remark says, there's only this. But saying there's only this only makes sense if there could be that. But the that, in this case, you cannot succeed in stating. So, as Trond said, there is no substantive metaphysical restriction here. What that means is that that can't be stated, so nor can the this be stated. We have to throw away the ladder. We have to overcome our desire to say things like, there is only logical necessity, or our desire to say all the things which are in the Tractatus and in Wittgenstein's later work, and to think that we're actually succeeding in making claims. Similarly, there is a theory of meaning in the Tractatus that the Tractatus itself encourages you to overcome and to, as he puts it, throw away. The theory doesn't survive you reaching, in the relevant sense, the end of the book. What Wittgenstein uses to subvert the natural necessity view, then, also subverts itself. And I think that gives Trond what she wants. It's deliberate nonsense. It clears the ground of itself implicitly, as well as of what it is criticizing explicitly. And here it might be related also to Sextus Empiricus's wonderful metaphor of the purgative. It says good philosophy is like a purgative. If you don't know what a purgative is, it's like a diarrhea pill or something that expels everything that's in your stomach. A good purgative expels itself as well as what it is purging. It doesn't hang around in the gut afterwards, and that's what Sextus Empiricus thought philosophy should be like, and I think Wittgenstein broadly follows him in this. And that's what it is to end in silence. That is what Wittgenstein means at the end of the Tractatus when he talks about silence. The actual practice or doing of science is part of what is left uncovered, or as Heidegger might have put it, disclosed by this kind of operation, I think. And finally, on what Trond was saying, I think the point that she was making, that scientific systems are optional but connected to the facts, is a very useful point. I'm not sure that optional is quite the right word. It seems to me to give one too much of a feel of kind of, well, it's up to you really. It makes it sound a bit too voluntaristic. Their scientific systems are clearly not optional when you are in them. As Kuhn would say, I think, a sense of optionality emerges under pressure when a science goes into crisis. And I think that this part of the Tractatus, where Wittgenstein is talking about the net that one applies to reality, could be regarded as a partial anticipation of Kuhn, or possibly as one of the questioners then suggested of Popper. And finally, turning to Richard Staley's talk, I thought the stuff on Mach and Hertz in relation to force, which brought to mind perhaps quotation 3 from my handout, this great influential quotation from Hertz on force, was very interesting and useful. I was, however, somewhat skeptical of some of the ways in which Richard sought to, if you like, ally Mach and Wittgenstein during the talk. As Jessica brought out in her question, it may be that there is a common ancestor to some extent in Goethe. Another object of comparison, if you will, that I'd like to bring up here would be Merleau-Ponty and his phenomenology. And I think that what Merleau-Ponty would say about the Gestalt style examples, which Richard put on the screen for us, is perhaps closer to what Wittgenstein would say about them than what Mach actually said about them. What Merleau-Ponty thought about these kind of Gestalt switch type examples and various other related phenomena is that what they showed is an indeterminacy of certain key perceptions that we have. It's not that you determinately see the different bands of color as being lighter near the boundaries and darker further up. There is that moment in the perception, but also once you've come to be told, for example, that actually they're all the same color, there's a kind of indeterminacy as whether you see them as all the same color or not. And what Merleau-Ponty thought, very roughly, is that reality is only describable through a tether to perception, and that perception is at certain key moments indeterminate. The scientists and physicists present in the room may have interesting thoughts about that, probably more interesting than my own. All I wish to do is to suggest that something like that thought is a thought which Wittgenstein, who was just as Merleau-Ponty was, absolutely fascinated by these Gestalt phenomena and wrote about them at length in his later years, might be closer to what Wittgenstein thought than what Mach actually said. Somewhat similarly, the idea of imagining someone as an automaton that Mach discusses, and this as being far more difficult than imagining them as ensouled. I think one of the things this shows us quite clearly is that there is not an operation of analogy going on here. And this is connected with one of the most important parts of the body of Wittgenstein's later work, his so-called anti-private language considerations, where what Wittgenstein is seeking to do is precisely to show that it's a complete mistake to think that we understand other people's consciousness or pain or what have you by analogy with our own. Rather, it's utterly natural for us to be with others and to see them and feel them as being ensouled, although it is something that with great difficulty we can get out of, or some people can get out of it with less difficulty. We call them psychopaths and things like that. Rather than, as philosophers have too often imagining us as being quintessentially isolated in our own minds. And I think that what Wittgenstein gives us there is a truly social understanding of human being, far more effectively than Mach gives us. And I've written about this a little, although not with reference to Mach, in my essay on this in New Literary History a few years ago. And finally, and this really is the final thing I want to say, another concern about Mach and Wittgenstein. Richard ended by saying that Mach and Wittgenstein were both unusual in taking the scope of the sciences to be as wide as they did. But I don't think that's right. As I've tried to suggest here today, I think that Wittgenstein was actually very skeptical about the idea of one taking the scope of the sciences to be as wide as someone like Mach taught them to be. For Wittgenstein, much, but not all, but much of what Mach did was hopelessly scientistic, precisely through taking the width of the scope or the reach of the sciences to be as great as Mach took them to be. And Wittgenstein thought that other approaches, such as philosophy, such as psychology, not conceived of as a science, such as social studies, not conceived of as being scientific, was actually far more apposite in giving us, if you will, a rounded understanding of the human position in the world, and indeed of the world more generally. And that in that sense, and so to come back finally to the talk with which I tried to begin the day, I think that what Wittgenstein thought was that if we wanted, among other things, to get clear about the nature, scope, reach and achievements of physics, one of the most crucial things we needed to do was precisely not to seek to overreach with that physics and move it into areas which were actually better understood as the preserves of other ways of understanding, being, knowing, or indeed being wise, which is, I think he thought rightly, the ultimate and very difficult objective. Thanks.
Well, Rupert, thank you for that gloriously authoritative summary of all the different things that we've been hearing about today. And I'm very glad you brought out not just the salient points of the talks, but things which you thought were contentious. I think that's very important to do, and I think you did it in a very, very constructive way. I might say, from my very humble physicist point of view, your comments about the laws of nature genuinely puzzle me because this is something I don't understand Wittgenstein's perspective and will lead me to think about it more deeply. Just for clarity there, the state of fundamental physics today is such that if you take quantum theory and relativity and gravity, they are incredibly rigid theories. It is extremely difficult to have a single idea about those theories that's not obviously wrong. So when you actually talk about laws of nature being a way of looking at things, that would seem very, very loose to a physicist. But that may be a cultural thing, and I'm very happy to learn from other disciplines. Rather than taking a lot of questions, which there would be, I think now, perhaps delaying some visits, journeys home, what we decided to do was to meet in the room where we had tea later on. Rupert's graciously agreed to be there in case we want to ask questions of him and, of course, of each other. So that's what we'll do straight after. I'm just 1 minute away from wrapping up. I just wanted to say that I, for one, have enormously enjoyed this opportunity of bringing together philosophy and physics. For too long, they have looked at each other with on physicists' part at least, with too much scepticism. There's a lot of room for them to come together and enrich each other. And I remember when Joe Ashbourne first wrote to me how excited I was by the initiative, and I'm so grateful to you, Joe, for bringing it together so brilliantly. I know you've been talking about it with James Dodd and other colleagues, but you in particular, I think, have done a magnificent job of bringing this programme together here in this first of what I hope will be many gatherings on this subject. So let's thank Joe and our host for a great day. Thank you very much.